When I was sent the kind of roster of the artists who are in the show, I realised that I've worked with at least a quarter, if not a third of them, over the last 8 or 10 years. So today, all I'm really going to do is like a really old school artist talk. And I'm going to talk just about various projects that I've done with various other artists who are also in this show. If I'm glaring, it's because I'm looking at a bulb, I'm sorry. So all you really see, each time I start talking about a new project, there'll be a slide up on the screen, the title, some info, and like a process note. And then I'll just show you some documentation of each of the projects. And all I'm going to do is really just narrate you through the projects. And I want to do that as a kind of jump-off, a way of talking kind of personally about some of the concerns or themes that are opened up by this show that have also underwritten what I do in my capacity as an artist, in my day job as basically an aesthetician, and in my kind of leisure pursuit with information as material. And all of this is like totally opinionated and just shamelessly, it's just my opinion, so don't read too much into it. But I'm sort of talking from the point of view of someone who's literally or metaphorically gone to the studio every day since his teens. So for what it's worth, that's what I'm going to talk about. Now, in all of these capacities that I mentioned as an artist, as an academic, and as an editor, all I've ever really done is what I would consider to be writing. And in a deceptively straightforward way, I've only ever really made poems. I've only ever really taught and theorized about reading art in the kind of Lawrence Wiener sense. And as an editor, all I've ever actually done is try to help see projects come into the world that I really want to read. It's kind of sad, selfish, complex. But before I start talking about sort of art stuff, I want to just really concisely spell out why I was never interested in being like a proper poet. And if you like, my interest in being an improper poet started because when I grew up, I inherited an understanding of poetry that's really beautifully sort of articulated by Rukaseya in the closing line of this poem. But my real problem with, if you like, the properness of proper poetry is better explained by this really short audio work from 2008. It's only about 3 minutes, I think, so if we just have a listen and then I'll explain afterwards.
The first poem I'm going to read is called In the Attic, and I wrote it when I was 20 years old and living in a house outside Oxford where I was a student. In the house where I grew up, we didn't have very many books or spend very much time talking about reading or what books might contain. But one of the books that I did know was The Diary of Anne Frank, and in my early 20s I went to visit her house in Amsterdam, and immediately after seeing it wrote this poem about it. This next poem is called The Letter. When I was growing up, I remember my mother telling me a story about how she, as a girl growing up during the Second World War, had been out for a walk in Burnham Beeches outside Beaconsfield one day and had seen a German fighter plane, somehow that had got detached from the rest of its flight and was obviously going to crash, and how spooky this had been for her. And for some reason this story stayed in my mind. And when I tried to write about it years later, I felt that the story itself wasn't enough but needed some other element introduced. So I made up another component, which was that the person who is telling this story and seeing the plane should have just received their first love letter. This next poem is called A Blow to the Head and is about just that, various kinds of people being hit on the head in various different ways. This poem is called The Spoilt Child and is about various kinds of privilege and the guilt that can attach to privilege, and it's written as a ballad. This next poem is called Goethe in the Park and is kind of miniature biography of a bit of wood which starts out as a tree and goes through various transformations. This next poem is one that I wrote after reading a book about the Crimean War, and in particular about the charge of the Light Brigade. I was told by this book of a little detail about a dog that accompanied the horses as they made their charge, and it seemed to me to say something touching and very interesting about the futility of the whole business. This short poem about the death of Princess Diana is one that I wrote at the invitation of the Times newspaper. In the book of Job in the Bible, there's a passage which says, "The fox provides for himself, but the lion speaks only to God." My father took part in the D-Day landings, and this poem describes what happened to him on that day and subsequently in Germany during the Second World War, but in fact is set in England and remembers the time that I was talking to him about the war. This little group of poems, alternately sonnets and not sonnets, is all about birds, familiar kinds of British birds. Some remembered from my childhood, some seen more recently, and over all of them there's an air, I hope, of concern for the environment and their survival. And their group is called Twitching, and it has an epigraph from the letters of John Keats. In fact, from a letter that John Keats wrote to his friend Bailey on the 22nd of November 1817, in which he says, famously, "If a sparrow come before my window, I take part in its existence and pick about the gravel."
Basically, my problem with that kind of proper poetry, the poetics of National Poet Laureate Satao, is that if you need the narrative fantasy of a little puppy dog to talk about something so complicated and so actually real as the Crimean War, then there's a fundamental problem with the way that you're speaking. In this case, it's the culture of mainstream verse writing. Okay? Now, one of the modernist hangovers that underwrites what I'm interested in when it comes to life generally is what Gabriele Giospavici describes here, really beautifully, I think, in that I'm kind of a school who try to do what we do out of respect for the world, and that really is absolutely ethically essential for me. But another one of my kind of modernist hangovers is that in a historically strong sense, I consider myself a constructivist. And as such, I'm only really interested in all of my capacities as an artist and as an academic and as an editor in the work itself, right? I'm not remotely interested in artists or authors or anything else. And I really understand myself as one little node in the continuum of artists who are interested in what kind of work it is that the artwork does, that the artwork demands, that the artwork makes possible. And the first thing that I ever wrote was with another artist who's also in this show called Pavel Bukla, whose work I understand to happen in the gaps within life when the concept of work is able to oscillate infinitely between a noun and a verb. And what you're seeing at the moment on screen is just a close-up of one page from that text that we wrote. And in the center, there's like a block set verbatim manuscript of a conversation we had. And then on top of that centerpiece and around it, there are all the revisions and editorial corrections that we went through, rendered in typographic markup. And then down the right-hand column, you can see the kind of final, revised, kind of proper academic essay. And all of the pages in this article follow the same kind of style sheet. I think it's about 9 pages in whole. I can't really sort of remember, but the kind of writing action that I just showed you is predicated on a pre-consciousness that the thing that one is going to write is going to be made public. So really, it's writing to be published, and that's really important. And that's precisely the kind of performativity that I'm interested in art, generally. And this is another work that I made with the same artist, Pavel. And we originally wrote the text. It was kind of commissioned for a little gallery in London for a show about the legacy of the philosophical duo Deleuze and Guattari. Felix Deleuze. Do you know this? It's called Toward the Minor Literature. Did you know this essay? Yeah, okay, cool. So it's basically, in this essay, Deleuze and Guattari, they do what sorry, I'm totally jet lagged. They do what philosophers do. They basically misuse some cultural example to testify to a sequence of conceptual propositions. And they do this with Kafka by extracting snippets from across his oeuvre, published and unpublished, diaries, novels, etc., all of which they cite without any regard for the chronological order in which they were actually written. And all Pavel and I did was we got rid of Deleuze and Guattari. We buttressed together the quotations from Kafka that were left behind. And just from that simple compositional process, we kind of produced a new work of minor literature. And what you kind of end up with is something that's almost more Kafkaesque than Kafka's own writings. The kind of original form was just a little booklet, a little sort of 8-page booklet of justified type on a kind of pulpy, paperback kind of novel stock. And it was loose leaf. So it kind of felt, or was hoped to feel like, it could have just dropped out of like Penguin or Vintage kind of collection of the complete writings of Kafka. Now the images you've seen of this work show that the whole text was then typeset onto 6 bay windows at the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven. And that's really the form that this work gets rolled out and redisplayed in now as a kind of vinyl typeset installation. But this interest in writing performed for publication really situates the art that I make and that I'm interested in firmly within the history of print culture. More so than what cultural studies would call visual culture, because the reference to visual culture is really folded in by the context of display and representation, by being represented as art, as it were. And this next piece is another example of that, and it's something that I wrote with a poet called Caroline Bergvall, who's in the elevator we keep hearing from every now and again. Now these scans are crap, I'm really sorry about that. It's really bad documentation, but if you can imagine that this is like an A4 scan bed, you can get a sense of the scale of the real book. And this is the front cover that you're seeing now. So it's just a tiny little pocket book, and it's made from the equivalent of one A4 sheet of paper with just one determinedly grey ink and one staple. And this is the cover spread. So the whole book just manipulates the way that double-page spreads are produced in codex books. So this is the inside cover, and all these slides just go sequentially through the whole book. It's short, I promise you. But to throw some context on it, so in the 1730s and the 1740s, a Scotsman called William Gedd realized that compositors were continually putting together the same sequences of the same individual letters because they were constantly printing the same literature, basically the Bible. And he came up with the idea of actually making these phrases into ready-made blocks of type. It sounds like dead obvious now, but he was the first guy to sort of figure it out. Now, for various reasons, he wasn't allowed to prove the efficiency saving of this innovation. But 10 years later, and unbeknownst, a member of the famous French family, the Didots, called Firmin, came up with exactly the same idea. And he made the first stereo plates, which sort of in technical printing speak were literally called stereotypes. So this word stereotype is actually a technical printing term. And the social connotations are a metaphorics based on that. So just as the term cliché is actually an onomatopoeic French word, and it's literally just the linguistic token that represents the dabbing sound of molten metal hitting the matrix to cast a printer's die. It's literally a cliché. So this book is really about the ways that clichés and stereotypes represent solidly preset phrases and expressions. And as you can see, this book turns that etymology and that connotation back upon one another. Because when you're printing a book, you print imposition spreads on large sheets, and then you cut them down, they're folded, they're stacked, and then they're saddled, right? So you print spreads of content that have to share the same piece of paper, not spreads that will actually end up together when the book is stacked. So this is it. It's just this tiny little thing. And this little format is something that was used in the late 20th century by various kind of activist printers because it's the perfect size to slip into a gentleman's breast pocket. And they're great. Like I basically trying to say that I really enjoy doing fun little things like this. You make 1,000 of them for like $200, so kind of fun little poem. Now, you'll have already noticed in the few things I've shown so far that although the compositional logic of these artworks is writerly, I'm not really using my own words. I'm not saying something myself in a conventional authorial sense, in the sense of a kind of capital A. And that's a very conscious choice. It's in part because I'm of a generation who inherited a permission leveraged for cultural production generally by art history. People of my generation who are now in our early 30s For people of my generation, now in our early 30s, appropriation was part of our historical inheritance. It was something that had been done, re-narrated by history. And when I grew up, life around me just was postmodern, and it was postmodern before I had any idea what modernism was. Now, the work I have in this show is one instance of how I've tried to use this anti-authorial approach to writing to explore the codifications of the history and historiologies that my generation inherited. In the case of this work, it's Samuel Beckett and the genre of kind of lit crit that is Beckett's studies. So the 3 prints in the show are just a series of 3 poems, each of which is just a direct citation from these famous list sections in Beckett's novel What? And you can see just an original kind of typing up from Beckett there on the screen. Now, What's a kind of weirdly important book in Beckett's studies, because even though it wasn't published until 53 or 54, it was the last thing that he wrote in English before switching to French as his first writing language. Plus, he sort of described it himself as a novel as fictively disappointing, but formally important as a first experiment. And you can see on screen 2 different editions, which are only there to prove that it's just been republished loads of times, and it sort of circles in really weird ways. But the edition that I first found was this one that you can see on the left, which is a John Calder edition. And the prints in the show literally undesign Calder's typography to find or borrow an aesthetic framework that can extend the concepts put at stake in the poems themselves as a kind of visual echo chamber, and that oxymoron's important. You can read the poems yourself upstairs, or if you haven't already, but they just work through a dead simple maneuver, and it's basically that all of the object articles in Beckett's lists are subjected to a kind of shallow parse, and then they themselves are replaced by the words that would stand in as their grammatical token. So they look like this. Now, I did it because I wondered if it could prove a hunch I had about Beckett's compositional logic, and because when I tried it, I really liked the way that the poems complete the nihilistic loop that Beckett's protagonist, Mr. Watt, puts himself through. Mr. Watt is the kind of constant he reference through the 3 poems, if you haven't sort of clocked that. So, what you can see now is a display of the prints at Limerick City Art Gallery in Ireland. And because that this technique of kind of undesigning is really important to the work that I make, the reference book is often shown alongside the print. And as a note of thanks to Nora and Andrea, I'm really pleased that you didn't do it. Partly because I know that when I go to see an artwork, I don't want to be given a cipher. But more so because although my writings appropriate wholesale texts, and although each work sort of minutely and precisely has a specific relationships with the specificities of some source text, so that the text, my text that I produce, kind of functions in an echo and that echoes back. For me, it's like a constitutive quality of being an artwork, that an artwork can stand alone as an artwork. And that's really important, and it's really important to this kind of genre of whatever's going on upstairs, you know. So, and now I think of these kinds of things that I write as performative readings. And these performative readings, for me, don't depend on a source. Rather, they try to imagine some new language act through a kind of productive tension with a specific source text. And that's different from the kind of dependency of like saying this and this are twins or something. Okay. And that's precisely why I understand what I do, how I understand what I do, and the site specificity of it. I really just make conceptualist reading performances. What you saw on the last slide on the left was the first French language edition of What? And on the right-hand side, you saw like a French translation of my prints that was editioned by a little museum in France. And these French translations carried over the same undesigning riff. They were using the iconic L'Édition de Minuit kind of layout that you'll have sort of recognized, I'm sure. And on an aside, I guess the reason I couldn't say no to doing like a French translation, a French edition, because Beckett was famously pedantic and oversaw the translation of all of his own work into and out of French. And so I kind of wondered if the translation could prove, through the maneuver, could prove this hunch I had about Beckett. And the hunch was that the architecture of Beckett's lists in What were composed at the substructural kind of grammatical level in the first place. I hope it did. I think it did. It seemed to. It did grammatically anyway. Now this image, unfortunately this image isn't mine, right? I would be so proud if it was, but it's my favorite image in art history. And this version you're seeing is a remake that was done in 1967 by an English printer called Trevor Hickman. But it's just a replica of a very famous block cut that was made by Matthias Huss as part of a suite of illustrations for an edition of the Danse Macabre, the Dance of Death, and it was published in Lyon in France in 1499. Now the image is famous because it's the first known representation of either a printing bureau or a bookseller. And what I really love about this image is that it actually shows the two together. It shows the whole process of publishing as a synthesized, pre-modern flow of productivity. And what I want to do now is talk really briefly about two works that I've done as part of this little writers collective called Information as Material. And I want to do so because, as I understand it, what we explore together as Information as Material is the possibility of pushing this uncreative performativity of writing for publication to a situation wherein we can conceptualize the act of writing as a compositional process of publishing. So when we work together, we kind of try to imagine writing as a praxis of publishing. Now, those of us in this collective are Craig, who you just heard a few minutes ago, and a guy you heard about a few minutes ago, Simon Morris, with the crazy rug thing, who's got another work upstairs in the show. So these slides that I'm going to show you are all just installation shots from our last solo exhibition, which was at the Whitechapel Gallery in London last year. And it was called Do or DIY. The show was really just an elaboration of a very short two-part essay that we wrote as a kind of catalogue forward. And the main body of the show itself really was just that essay text, which you can see in this first slide is vinyl set right across all of the gallery walls. Now these gallery rooms are themselves kind of curious because up until quite recently they were actually the reading rooms in what was the Whitechapel Public Library. And the light box you can see we put on the floor here was actually the original door sign from that library. Now this essay that forms the main body of the show, was really short and it had two parts. And the first part is just an anecdotal kind of micro-history about authors who are heralded in the English language kind of literary canon, but actually self-published their own work. And so it ranges from like Martin Luther and his theses in the 15th century, all the way up to sort of Kathy Ackers and beyond, and these sorts of people. And what you can see propped up against the kind of skirting boards running around the rim of the floor is like a kind of free-to-handle reference library of mass-reproduced editions of all of the originally self-published books that were mentioned in the essay. And so visitors could just come in and hang out and just pick up the book and read whatever they want, you know. And then in these kind of three museum cases that were stalled through the various gallery rooms, you can see, well, you would be able to see, inside them were first edition copies of these self-published, or 8 of these self-published works that are all mentioned in the essay. So there's a copy of Ezra Pound's Lume Spente, there's a copy of Kathy Ackers' Great Expectations, there's a collection of John Ruskin poems and all that sort of thing in there. And I think what we were trying to do with this show was to unwork or work back open this kind of concealed history of self-publishing. And it was doing so kind of as a way of thinking about the positive, contemporary potential for self-publishing as a kind of DIY action against the mainstream idea of vanity publishing. And that kind of positive look forward was, you know, what happens in the super short kind of polemical second part of the essay. You can download this thing for free on the gallery's website. Oh, you could, I presume you can. It's be dead easy to find. But the last part of the show was that on this kind of oak reading table that you could see in the last slide, which was actually part of the reading room of the Whitechapel Public Library that was there before, we put on out like a stack of free-to-take little pocket books, which are just copies of that essay in this fun little form. And this is just the cover spread of that pocketbook. Now you can see on the front cover that there's a clipped reproduction of an 18th century etching done based on a portrait of Laurence Sterne by the very famous English painter Joshua Reynolds. And Sterne was actually like the opening anecdote in the essay because he self-published the first 2 volumes of the original 9 volumes that made up his most famous novel, The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy. And the example of Tristram Shandy is one that all three of us in the collection have worked on, not least because Sterne was the reverend during his lifetime in a tiny little village in North Yorkshire, really close to where Simon and I are based in England. And so then this show, Do or DIY, toured up there to Lawrence Sterne's old house, which is now a museum, and was reformatted for their really beautiful garden. And that's what you can see now. And so the idea, like here, it wasn't sort of my call, but like the idea was just like book pages, as if they'd been sort of blown really up massive onto placards, and then sort of scattered and strapped to the garden, like oversized book pages that had sort of been blown in a gust of wind. It's like, there's a beautiful Hokusai print, the Jeff Wall remix. It was that kind of thing in a drunken moment, I think. This is all very English, I'm sorry, like cute little white people looking at stuff in quaint villages. But Do or DIY was this show that was the culmination of a longer residency that we did as a collective at this gallery, the Whitechapel Gallery. And during that residency, one of the other things that we did was to publish a series of sort of free-to-take conceptualist poster poems. And one of them was this one that's described here. It's a quiz sheet, and it's made to look like, it's made up as like a giant fly poster, but it's laid out like a really shit like pub quiz or something like that. And it's a re-articulation of a critique of mainstream literature's claim to originality that was written about at length in an anthology called Against Expression, which Craig and another one of our dear friends, Kenneth Goldsmith, who's here in the show for sure, edited together. It sounds like you all know it. Now, as you can read from here, you can sort of read for yourself on the screen, this critique works by offsetting the synopses of new novels against the synopses of canonical novels. And as well as the poster format, which anyone can just sort of download as a print-ready PDF, we also put this quiz up online on one of these kind of automated quiz sites. And so this is a screenshot of exactly that. So you have a little read, it's kind of, see if you get it right. And this is just another close-up of the back end of that same quiz. And one of the things that I find really interesting about the possibility of publishing as a praxis in an age of kind of born digital network media are the kinds of weird paratexts and database-driven language acts that these networks actually produce, or at least birth. Like the final kind of gold star question here that the website automatically added to our quiz, which is like really wonderful. I got the bonus point, by the way. So. But the thing is, like, you really couldn't write shit like that. You really couldn't write shit like that. And that's exactly why this sort of field of relations is interesting for making art, as a kind of contemporary writing practice, or a space for it at least. And the last piece that I'm going to show you is a preview. It's a preview of a work that I'm finishing with someone else in this exhibition called Rob Fitterman. And this piece will be like an online-only work. And today I'm just going to kind of play you like a live maquette. But we did this as a way of exploring how these fields of networked relations can and do produce new grammars of subject-to-subject relationships. And through these new grammars, they also produce new grammars of database-determined language acts. So you've got this doubling up of new grammars, and they speak of each other. So, oh, sorry. We're going to go to Safari World. I hope. Okay. Okay.
Starbucks, Taco Bell, Staples, Kmart.
So this work's really like, it's all about incessant. You can leave it up. You can dance as well if you want. So the work's all about incessants and kinds of constructed euphorias. It's really, I guess it's about the simulacra of kind of marketable ecstasies. I honestly leave, oh no, that's
Taco Bell.
So, and all the work does, you can kind of see most of like what's just a browser window. That's it. And
KFC.
all of the work does, it's really simple. It just triangulates three databases.
Staples.
And it randomly overlaps them in new loops or orders every time you reload the web page.
Kmart,
So these little instrumental loops that you can hear, these crescendos are from David Guetta, or Guetta, I don't know how you pronounce his name, but his sort of, what you want to call it, it's like the epitome formula for reductive pop dance music. And if, like me, dance music sort of meant something to you when you were young, you know how horrible this is.
Wendy's.
Then these vocals are Rob reading from an older work of his, or a section of an older work of his called Metropolis 16.
Staples.
And if you know that work, it's all just the shopping mall lists that are buried in the middle of that book. And so he read them, and then each stanza from within the shopping mall lists was broken into an individual sound file. And so then in another player simultaneously here, they're being constantly shuffled, those sound files.
Sunglass Hut. Kmart.
And then you just got this one GIF in the middle, like that's the only image content. And
KFC.
it's from like a banner advert for about weight loss. And it's both the grossest and most wonderful image I've seen in ages. But it kind of dances, you get it.
Kmart.
So this is this is totally gross, but I thought I'd show it to you because it kind of summarizes the style of writing that I do and that I like. Because I'm basically interested in precision and intensity, and that's it really, frankly.
Staples.
But also because it hints at some of the longer and larger work that I'm doing about contemporary writing in an age of database-driven grammars within the context of sculpture, quite specifically.
Taco Bell. Starbucks.
Now for me, conceptualism is an approach to making that goes before and beyond in the practice of art, before and beyond the historical categories of conceptual art or conceptual writing. Either of those understood with capital C's, right? But the relevance of those two historical categories and the speculative potential of their cross-fertilization can be sort of philosophically explained.
Dunkin' Donuts.
So I'm just going to mute it. And this one's a bit dense, but this is just the conclusion. So by way of a conclusion, to say something generally, like the fundamental importance of conceptual art was the consequence of its failure, or the failure of its purist project. And that purist project is probably best exemplified in the Anglo-American canon by someone like Joseph Kossuth, right? So basically, conceptual art tried and failed to create a kind of art that was purely conceptual. But in trying and failing, it irrevocably changed art, because it proved that all art is always conceptual and aesthetical. Like that is conceptual art's legacy, like epistemologically. And that, for me, is how conceptual art recalibrated the epistemology and practice of doing art and experiencing art. And that's why all art after conceptual art is exactly that. Art after conceptual art, whether you like it or not, is art after conceptual art. Therefore, conceptuality is a constitutive dynamic of all contemporary art. It is one of the things that determines the kind of contemporary that we speak of when we use the phrase contemporary art. And this is one of the most fundamentally misunderstood things about the theorization of contemporary art. The difficult job isn't really to figure out what art means, to figure out what concept of the contemporary is at stake when you use the term. So the question that all of this leaves behind, and the cross-fertilization leaves behind, is how you try to relate to the fact of this legacy. And that's it. Thank you.